The control center is a cathedral of cold, white light. Robotic arms stand like silent soldiers, their lights a confident green. Suddenly, the monitor turns a violent crimson. System safety shutdown. Robotic arms freeze mid-motion, holding millions in equipment. Engineers stare at tablets, paralyzed. Rachel Kim, the billionaire CEO, grips her radio, her voice cracking with stress. At the edge of the floor, a single dad in a worn uniform stops his cart. He kneels, presses his bare hand against the vibrating floor, and looks up. He whispers into the silence, "It's not the software." The world holds its breath. His name is Daniel Ross, 46 years old, a man whose presence in the state-of-the-art facility is as unremarkable as the bolts he tightens every morning. To the high-level software architects, the AI designers, and the data scientists at Ross Kim Automation, he is a relic of a dying era, a manual worker in a world that claims to have moved past the need for human touch. Daniel is a maintenance technician, but not the kind who writes sophisticated scripts. He is the man who carries a heavy, scratched steel wrench, who checks the physical joints, and who logs the structural groans that no computer seems to care about. He wears a faded navy blue uniform with Ross stitched in white thread, his hands scarred by decades of heat, friction, and metal. The hands of a man who understands the raw, physical weight of the world. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., Daniel's world starts in a quiet, two-bedroom apartment that smells like blueberry waffles and hope. He spends his first hour of the day double-checking 8-year-old Lena's math homework and making sure the blue ribbon for her hair is tied just right. This is his real work. The factory, with its humming servers and cold steel, is just a backdrop to his life as a father. Every afternoon, in the quiet corner of the workers' break room, Lena sits with her coloring books and school binders. She is Daniel's entire universe, his sun, his moon, and his only anchor in a life that once sailed through much darker, more violent waters. Daniel wasn't always a janitor of machines. 10 years ago, he was known in the industry as the ghost of the girders, the lead structural engineer who designed the most complex suspension systems in the country. He was the man who could listen to the wind whistling through a cable and tell you if the tension was off by a single pound. But after the accident that took his wife 4 years ago, a moment where speed and corporate pressure overrode his safety warnings, he burned his ties to that world. He needed to be the man who was always there to pick his daughter up from school at 3:30 p.m., the man who never missed a parent-teacher conference or a weekend trip to the park. He chose the silence of the factory floor over the noise of the boardroom, convinced that being a good dad was a far higher calling than being a titan of industry. He tucked his advanced degrees into an old shoebox, buried his ambitions, and put on the uniform of a servant. Before the inspectors arrived today, Daniel had spent 3 hours inspecting the subfloor struts. He didn't use a digital scanner, he used a coin. He would place it on the edge of the steel plate and watch the way it danced. If the dance was erratic, it meant the resonance was building. He would stand by the main support pillar, feeling the vibration travel through his boots into his spine. It was a frequency he called the factory's pulse, a rhythm that shifted as the sun moved across the roof, heating the outer shell while the inner core stayed chilled. The AI saw numbers. Daniel felt the soul of the geometry. He had filled 4 pages of his notebook with these erratic dances. He knew that the floor was a living thing, expanding and contracting with the heat of the machines. But to the architects in the control room, the floor was just a constant in an equation. They didn't see the way the steel sighed under the weight of the new robotic mounts. The factory has recently undergone what the media calls a digital coronation. Rachel Kim, at 40, is a visionary who has been hailed by every tech magazine as the Queen of Industry 4.0. She has spent hundreds of millions transforming this facility into a dark factory, a place where machines talk to machines, where algorithms optimize every millisecond, and where humans are meant to be mere observers. She believes that human intuition is a variable of error, a flaw to be removed. Today is the most critical day of her professional life. A group of international safety inspectors and lead investors are on site for a final demonstration of the Oracle AI. If the factory runs at 100% capacity for 6 hours without a single human intervention, Rachel becomes the global standard for automation. If it fails, her reputation and her empire will shatter like glass. Daniel has been watching the floor for 3 days with a growing sense of unease. He noticed a microscopic, almost imperceptible vibration in the expansion joints near the main assembly line. It wasn't a software bug, it was a physical reality. He reported it to his immediate supervisor, a young man named Marcus with a master's degree in data science who had never felt the heat of a welding torch. The answer was always the same. The AI is monitoring the structural integrity in real time, Daniel. The sensors are precise to the micron. If there was a problem, the computer would flag it before you could even see it. Stick to the bolts. Daniel didn't argue. He simply checked on Lena, tucked his notebook into his pocket, and waited. He knew that sensors only read what they are programmed to see, but the metal never lies. The demonstration begins with a flourish of digital graphics, soaring orchestral music, and the rhythmic thumping of heavy machinery coming to life. The observation deck is filled with billionaires and global regulators, their eyes fixed on the massive glass panels as Rachel Kim takes the stage. Her voice is a masterclass in corporate confidence, smooth, sharp, and unshakable. "Welcome to the era of zero-error production," she says, her silk suit shimmering under the sterile, blue-tinted lights. "This factory doesn't just work, it thinks. Our Oracle AI optimizes every movement, every microsecond, removing the guesswork, the fatigue, and the inevitable errors of the human element. Today, we show you the peak of efficiency." The load on the assembly line begins to ramp up as the investors watch the digital counters climb. The robotic arms move with a terrifying, fluid grace, swinging heavy carbon fiber components into place with millimetric precision. The noise in the factory floor is a synchronized, metallic symphony. 50% capacity, 70, 85. The room is electric with the scent of success, high-grade ozone, and the hum of massive servers. Inside the glass-walled control room, the AI engineers are nodding in unison, their fingers dancing across glowing tablets. "All metrics are nominal," Marcus whispers to Rachel. "The AI's confidence score is at 99.9%. The thermal load is perfectly balanced within the 0.01% margin. We are looking at history." But down on the floor, Daniel Ross isn't looking at the screens. He is standing near the Sector 7 expansion joint, his boots planted firmly on the steel grating. He sees the way the floor plates are beginning to shimmer, not from the light, but from a high-frequency resonance. He can feel the floor plates grinding against their mounts, a sound that is muffled by the roar of the arms but clear as a bell in his bones. He knows that every 0.1 millimeter of expansion is putting a lateral load on the robot's anchor bolts that the AI isn't calculating. The sensors are looking at the arm, but Daniel is looking at the foundation. To the sensors, it looks like background noise that can be filtered out by the logic gates. To Daniel, it looks like the prelude to a mechanical heart attack. The metal is heating up. The expansion joints are reaching their physical limit under the 100% load, and the alignment of the main drive shaft is starting to deviate by a fraction of a hair. He steps toward the intercom and keys in the supervisor's private line one last time. The thermal expansion is uneven in the floor joists, near the primary assembly wing, Daniel says, his voice low, steady, and devoid of panic. The AI is compensating for the arm speed, but it's ignoring the torque drag on the base plates. You need to pull back the load to 80% or the safety trip will trigger. Now, the response is immediate, cold, and condescending. "Daniel, the Oracle has conducted 4 million simulations of this specific load. It knows the expansion variables better than any human eyes. You're reacting to ghosts. Do not interfere with the demo. You are a maintenance tech, not a systems designer." Get back behind the safety line before I have you escorted out. Daniel watches as the temperature on the floor-level sensors begins to climb into the amber zone. The AI sees the heat, but its logic assumes the heat is coming from the robotic motors themselves, so it increases the cooling flow to the arms. It doesn't realize the heat is coming from the friction of the floor plates rubbing against the concrete foundation. It is a fatal logic loop. The AI is trying to solve a digital ghost while the real problem is literally moving the ground. A high-pitched siren, a sound designed to pierce through any industrial noise, erupts from the ceiling. The giant monitor in the VIP lounge flashes in a violent cadence. Input conflict, critical discrepancy, system safety shutdown. In a split second, the entire production line comes to a violent, dead stop. The robotic arms freeze in midair, one of them oscillating slightly from the sudden, brutal loss of momentum. A carbon fiber housing worth $600,000 hangs inches from the floor, held by a frozen claw. The silence that follows is heavier, more suffocating than the noise. The investors stand up, their faces moving from awe to deep suspicion. Rachel Kim stands at the podium, her hand frozen in the air, her coronation turning into a billion-dollar funeral for her reputation. The smartest factory in the world has just turned itself into a silent, expensive tomb. No one knows where to start because the computer says there is no error in the code, but the machines refuse to move. The system has blinded itself with its own perfection. The silence in the control center is absolute, save for the frantic, rhythmic clicking of keyboards as the AI team tries to force a remote override. Rachel Kim walks off the stage, her heels clicking sharply on the floor like a death march as she approaches her lead engineers. Her voice is a dangerous whisper, the sound of a woman who sees her legacy slipping away. Why is my factory standing still? The diagnostic says the code is clean. The fail-safe says mechanical interference. But the sensors say the motors are fine. Where is the conflict? Give me an answer. The engineers look at each other, sweating in their climate-controlled room. We don't know, Rachel. The Oracle is behaving exactly as programmed. It sees a physical world that doesn't match its mathematical model, so it's protecting itself by locking down. It's like the factory has a blind spot that isn't in the code. Daniel Ross takes a slow, deliberate step out from the line of maintenance workers. He doesn't look at the tablets. He doesn't look at the monitors. He walks straight to the center of the floor, through the yellow safety tape, and kneels down near the base of the primary robot. He doesn't use a sensor. He uses his bare hand, pressing his palm against the steel. The heat is intense, radiating through the plating. He can feel the metal molecules screaming. The blind spot isn't in your software, Ms. Kim, Daniel says, his voice resonant and calm, the sound of a man who has lived in the eye of the storm before. It's under your feet. Your AI can calculate the friction of the machine, but it can't feel the expansion of the foundation. This floor is steel-plated, and the heat from the 100% load today has caused a thermal expansion of exactly 0.4 millimeters. That's enough to tilt the robotic axis just enough to trigger a logic conflict in the sensors. Your sensors are reading the machine as tilted, while the AI thinks it's level. The math broke because the world changed. Rachel looks at the man in the worn uniform. She sees the name Ross on his badge. She remembers a name from a decade ago, a brilliant structural engineer who vanished from the high-stakes world after a bridge failure in the Midwest. A failure where he was the only one who predicted the collapse. Thermal expansion, she asks, her voice finally lacking its corporate edge. The sensors should have compensated for that. The sensors are mounted on the robots, not the floor, Daniel says, standing up and meeting her gaze. They're moving with the problem, so they can't see it. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. I warned your supervisor 3 days ago, and again 5 minutes ago. If you want this factory to run, you don't need a software patch. You need to vent the subfloor heat manually. And I need to realign the B-axis by hand using a physical spirit level. I need to bypass the AI's 0 point and reset it to the current physical reality. I need to do what a computer can't. I need to feel the metal. A junior manager steps forward, his face flushed with ego. We don't do manual resets anymore. That violates every safety protocol in the Smart Factory manual. It could corrupt the entire learning model. We need to wait for a software update from the developer. Daniel looks the manager in the eye, a gaze so steady and cold it makes the younger man flinch. Then, Daniel turns his gaze to Rachel Kim. He isn't begging for a job. He is offering a lifeline. Do you want to follow the manual? Daniel asks, his voice cutting through the tension. Or do you want to run the factory and save your merger? Because in 4 minutes, the thermal sink will lock the joints permanently as they cool. Then, you won't need a technician, you'll need a wrecking ball. Rachel looks at her investors, who are now checking their watches, talking in hushed, angry tones about reliability failures. She looks at the man who touches the metal, and for the first time in years, she chooses a person over a program. Everyone, get back behind the safety line, Rachel commands, her voice echoing through the hangar. She looks at Daniel. You have 3 minutes. Reset the line. Daniel grabs his heavy tool bag. He moves onto the factory floor with a rhythmic, efficient pace. He doesn't run. He doesn't panic. He climbs under the main assembly platform, the heat radiating off the steel, hitting him like a furnace. His hands move with the grace of a master craftsman. He loosens the manual locks. He uses a physical spirit level he's carried for 20 years, and he tightens the mounting bolts with a force that makes the steel groan. The wrench bit into the steel, the metal-on-metal scream echoing in the tight space. Every muscle in his back strained as he fought the thermal lock, a man against the raw, unyielding pressure of physics. He could feel the exact threshold where the bolt would snap, a sense of tension that no digital torque wrench could replicate. The billionaires watch in absolute silence as this nobody man wrestles with the physical world. He taps the metal twice, listening to the ring. Solid. He climbs out, his face covered in sweat and grease, and gives a simple thumbs up to the control room. The floor is settled. I've manually calibrated the 0 point to the current expansion. Wait for the thermal sink, then fire the sequence. Now, the hangar is deathly quiet as Rachel Kim gives the order into her headset. Reinitialize the Oracle AI manual override on structural parity. Fire Sector 7. Let's see if the metal listens to him. The robotic arms hum to life with a low, powerful growl that vibrates in the teeth of everyone watching. But this time, the movement is fundamentally different. It's smoother, more fluid, more human. The rhythmic, nervous shivering in the floor is gone. The line accelerates, 40%, 70, 90, and finally, 100. The status light on the giant monitor stays a beautiful, unwavering, triumphant green. The AI accepts the data because it finally matches the physical world it occupies. Rachel Kim should be at the center of the celebration, but she is standing at the very edge of the floor, watching Daniel Ross walk back to the workers' lounge to pack his lunch. He looks tired, but his eyes are clear. She catches up to him just as he reaches the door, away from the cameras and the noise. Mr. Ross, wait. Daniel stops, his heavy toolbox in his hand. Rachel looks at his grease-stained fingers, then at his calm, tired eyes. She sees the scars on his knuckles and realizes they weren't made by a keyboard. They were made by a lifetime of respecting the material. I read your name on the internal logs just now, she says softly, her voice trembling with a mix of shame and awe. You're Daniel Ross, the lead designer for the Iron Bridge systems 10 years ago. You were the man who predicted the structural failure of the interstate bypass, the man who tried to save those people when no one would listen. Why are you mopping floors and tightening bolts in my factory for $20 an hour? Daniel looks at the glass break room, where Lena is now standing up, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes shining with a pride that outshines every light in the factory because she saw her dad save the day. I'm not mopping floors, Ms. Kim, Daniel says, a small, tired smile touching his lips. I'm raising a daughter, and in this facility, I'm the only one who still remembers that machines don't have a heartbeat. They only have a tolerance level. Your team forgot that a smart factory is only smart if it knows when to listen to the person who actually touches the metal. You were so busy looking at the future that you forgot you were standing on the ground. I didn't stay in the high-stakes world because I realized that the most important structures aren't made of steel. They're made of time. Time spent with her. Rachel lowers her head. For the first time in her brilliant, unstoppable career, she isn't the most important person in the room. She looked at his hands again. They weren't just dirty. They were the hands of a protector. In that bridge failure years ago, the world had blamed the materials, but Daniel had known it was the hubris of the builders who thought they were gods. She thought about her own hands, perfect, manicured, and disconnected. She realized she had become a ghost in her own machine, ruling a world she no longer understood the foundation of. Now, in her own factory, she had almost repeated that history. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the heavy weight of a lesson finally learned. She realizes that her digital revolution almost ended in a disaster, not because the AI failed, but because her ego had created a blind spot that only a father's hands could fix. She looks at her engineers, their expensive tablets and their clean hands, then back at the single dad. She realizes that true power doesn't come from a title or an algorithm. It comes from the quiet strength to be present when everything else is falling apart. The demonstration is recorded as a historic success. Grant Robotics is hailed as the future of humanity. But inside the factory, everything has changed. Rachel Kim has issued a new, sweeping directive: validation through intuition. She has restructured the entire maintenance department, not as a support role, but as a lead validation group with veto power over the AROI's speed increases. She finds Daniel Ross at the exit gate at exactly 3:15 p.m. He is holding Lena's hand, her backpack slung over his shoulder. He looks like a different man, lighter, as if he finally laid down a burden he's been carrying for a decade. Daniel, I want you to head the new Operational Integrity Division, Rachel says, her tone finally humble, sincere, and human. I need a conscience for this AI. I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me I'm wrong, even when the board is screaming that I'm right. I'm offering you a salary that matches our lead architects and a seat at the executive table. We need the man who hears the metal, the man who remembers the ground. Daniel looks at Lena, who is pulling at his hand, eager for their traditional Friday ice cream and a trip to the bookstore. He looks back at Rachel. I have one condition, Ms. Kim. I don't do overtime. I don't do international press tours. I don't do board meetings that run past sunset. And I leave every single day at this exact time to be at the school gate by 3:30. My priority isn't your stock price. My priority is her. If those are the terms, then we have a deal. I'll help you build your future, but I won't sacrifice hers. Rachel smiles, a real, genuine, warm smile that her board of directors has never seen. It is a smile of a woman who finally understands what value really means. Daniel, after today, I've learned that we need you at 3:30 more than we need you at midnight. Your terms are accepted. In fact, we'll build a study lounge for Lena in the control wing, right next to your office. She can learn physics from the man who actually understands how the world stays together. Lena runs into her father's arms, hugging him tight. You were so cool, Daddy. You fixed the big robots. Are we superheroes now? No, buddy, Daniel says, lifting her up and kissing her cheek. We're just the people who make sure the superheroes stay on the ground. The work is done. Let's go get that triple scoop ice cream. The factory is a hum behind them, a steady, rhythmic, and peaceful song of progress. But the machines are no longer the masters. They are tools, guided by the hand of a man who knows when to step up, and the wisdom of a woman who finally learned when to listen. The room is finally quiet, and for the first time in years, it is exactly as it should be. Daniel Ross is no longer a ghost in the system. He is the heartbeat. If you believe that the human heart is the most powerful technology of all, subscribe for more stories of the masters hidden in the shadows. And tell me in the comments, what is one thing in your life that you think should never be fully automated? Let's talk about it below.